다음은 마크 앱스타인. 이분은 그 작가입니다. 우리 되게 우리 명상 쪽에 많이 잘 알려져 있고요. 또 신경정신과 의사 선생님이기도 하시고 저서가 제법 많습니다. 저도 읽어본 책들이 몇 개 있는데 이분을 모시고 트라우마에 대한 숙고, 심리치료에 불교수행, 접목하기라는 제목의 강의를 듣겠습니다.
My name is Dr. Mark Epstein, and I'm a psychiatrist and a writer in New York City, the author of a number of books about the interfacing of Buddhism and psychotherapy. Most of what I do is the practice of one-on-one psychotherapy, but I had the privileged and unusual experience of being exposed to Buddhism, learning about Buddhism, sitting Vipassana or mindfulness meditation retreats for a number of years before deciding to go to medical school with the idea of becoming a psychiatrist. So all of my interest in and learning about Western psychotherapy was always filtered through a Buddhist lens. And I've always been interested in how Buddhist psychology, traditional Buddhist psychology, and Western psychodynamically influenced psychotherapy, how they could work together, how they complement each other, how they've helped me personally, and how they could potentially help the many patients who I've worked with over the years. So I'm delighted to be able to speak to you today from quarantine in New York State. About the interplay of Buddhism and psychotherapy, in particular about the treatment of trauma, and how my Buddhist background and my psychodynamic background have come together in my thinking to help patients who have been afflicted with various kinds of trauma. And that's what I'm going to speak to you about now. Trauma has long been thought of as something that happens only in extreme circumstances and mostly to other people. We are sensitive to it, but we tend to keep it at arm's distance if we can. Therapists diagnose it when certain critical conditions occur. A person must witness one or more events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others. In addition, their response must involve intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Those close to the World Trade Center attacks of 9/11 or the Sri Lanka Easter bombings obviously qualify. Battlefield veterans and the journalists who covered them also do. Those who are caught up in sudden catastrophic natural events like earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, and tornadoes experience trauma, as do people in motor vehicle accidents. A friend of mine was on an airplane almost 40 years ago that ran off the Boston, Massachusetts runway into the harbor upon landing. She was on a short flight from New York and it was foggy and cold. 2 people were killed when the plane skidded off the icy runway, fell off the seawall, and broke in two. For several days thereafter, my friend was convinced in an eerily detached way that her body was going to explode. I was doing my medical internship and I called a supervisor and brought her to the emergency room of the Massachusetts General Hospital. Psychiatrists there diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress, a new concept at that time. She had been caught in an event that threatened her physical well-being, and while she was outwardly calm, her underlying emotional state was one of intense fear and helplessness. With one part of her mind, she knew she was reacting to the accident and was in fact no longer at risk. But with another part of her mind, she was ready to erupt. The trauma, having created a split, reverberated within. There's another kind of trauma that also reverberates. Children, especially young children, have all kinds of intense emotions like fear, helplessness, and horror, before they have the language to describe or process them. Young children lack the capacity to understand what they are feeling. They are operating at an instinctual level, not on an adult one. But they have a need for their feelings to be understood, even if they are incapable of understanding them themselves. Young children are completely dependent on their parents or caregivers for this. Like my friend on the airplane, they are constantly in danger of slipping out of control. Many parents intuitively sense their children's vulnerabilities and help them in all kinds of ways. They notice the feelings, put them into perspective, let their children know they are there, and put language on the experience. They open up links between the child's minds and their feelings. In many ways, they work to make their children's experience more tolerable. But when there's too much failure in this system, the emotions of childhood can be overwhelming and unbearable. Just imagine the feelings of a year-old baby left alone past the point of self-soothing. There is trauma inherent in such a scenario, and it often lives on. The primitive agonies of childhood survive into adulthood and can make us behave as irrationally as my friend in her plane crash. While most parents work hard to protect their children from the inherent instability of life, it is impossible to completely avoid it. Even if we make it through childhood and adolescence in one piece, even if we are not subject to natural or man-made catastrophes, and even if we live a healthy life, we are inevitably going to have confrontations with death, serious injury, and threats to our own or our loved ones' physical integrity. I like to say that if we're not already suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, we suffer from a pre-traumatic one. The threat of trauma runs through life like an underground river. None of us are invulnerable, and no one is impervious to change. Trauma impacts us even if we do not want it to. We cannot think our way around it. Like my friend after her airplane debacle, try though we may with the rational part of the brain, we cannot avoid trauma's impact. The Buddha was one of the world's first great psychologists. Long before there was a special word for trauma, he articulated the concept. He encapsulated his insights in his famous Four Noble Truths and gave the first truth, his diagnosis of the human condition, in a single word, dukkha. Dukkha is usually translated as suffering, but a more accurate representation of its meaning might be something more like pervasive unsatisfactoriness. Life is tinged with a sense of pervasive unsatisfactoriness because of how fleeting and unpredictable it is. We want to have control, but despite all of our efforts, we ultimately do not. The word dukkha actually means hard to face. There are aspects of life that are hard to face, taught the Buddha. We do our best not to look at them. In describing this process, the Buddha was describing our most common coping mechanisms. In an effort to protect the ego from disintegrating under the pressure of unbearable emotions, feelings are shunted to the side. We close down to avoid them, make ourselves rigid and tense, and soldier on, devoting ourselves to work and family if we are lucky, or drowning ourselves in addiction if we are not. Psychologists call this dissociation. The offending and threatening feelings are literally buried, but they are still there in the psyche and they grab at us when we are not looking. Their symptoms may not be as explicit as the fears of exploding were to my friend, but they reverberate nonetheless. The effort to protect ourselves against trauma has the unintended side effect of closing ourselves off to ourselves and to others. The Buddha was conscious of this. Perhaps it was because he suffered an early loss himself. His mother died when he was but a week old. And perhaps it was because he repeated this trauma, abandoning his wife and son several days after his birth. But his journey to enlightenment involved figuring out a way of confronting all of the feelings that were initially hard for him to face. The way out is through, he eventually discovered. Trauma, when acknowledged, becomes a window into an open heart and mind. This is a very difficult thing to accept. It goes against all of our conditioning. Many of us feel immediate sympathy when traumatic events impact other people. Our hearts go out to them. But there is a rush to normal in most of us. We expect people to get over it sooner rather than later. When the Swiss psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross proposed a 5-stage model for grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, people took it to mean we should proceed through the 5 stages sequentially and return to baseline as soon as possible. When grief lingers, we turn away. But mourning is part of life. Anyone who is alive to his or her feelings will experience it. And it has a life of its own. Only by making room for it as it actually is, not as how we imagine it should be, can we learn from it. If you bring forth what is within you, said the hidden Christian Gospels, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Learn from trauma. What can we learn from trauma? When I was in my early 20s, I traveled to a forest monastery in rural Thailand where a friend of mine had studied as a monk. My friend took me to meet his teacher, a meditation master named Ajahn Chah. I had one chance to ask him a question, and the question was something like this: why dukkha? Why is that the important thing? Isn't it a little depressing? Doesn't the emphasis on suffering give Buddhism a bad name? What can we possibly learn from it? Ajahn Chah answered in the following way. Do you see this glass? He said, picking up the drinking glass by his side. For me, this glass is already broken. I enjoy it. I drink out of it. It holds the water admirably. It reflects the light in beautiful ways. If I tap it, it has a lovely ring. But when I put this glass on a shelf and the wind knocks it off, or my elbow brushes it off the table and it falls and breaks, I say, of course. Yet when I understand that this glass is already broken, every minute with it is precious. It took me a while, but the special thing about Buddhism was that last sentence. That last sentence is what moved me the most. When I understand that this glass is already broken, every minute with it is precious. Facing the brokenness of life allows us to appreciate its preciousness. Trauma is happening all around us. It is a fact of everyday life. It is always touching someone, and it will eventually touch us all if it hasn't already. If we can face this matter-of-factly, as parents must face the battered feelings of their children, we can wake up our own capacities for empathy and compassion. Empathy, writes the writer Leslie Jameson in a book called The Empathy Exams, means realizing no trauma has discrete edges. Trauma bleeds out of wounds and across boundaries. Empathy, she continues, demands another kind of porousness in response. The porousness she refers to is the same as the one of the broken glass. Trauma, if it doesn't destroy us, can be a great teacher. It makes us more human, caring, and wise, and it is available to everyone, part and parcel of everyday life. For me, the writings of the British child psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott have proven to be the most inspirational on this topic, a way of bringing together a psychoanalytic and a Buddhist vision. Winnicott describes the primitive agonies of childhood, in which the emotional environment between parent and child is not what it could be. The emotions of childhood, anxiety, fear, rage, loneliness, and insecurities of all kinds, are potentially overwhelming. An infant is completely dependent on its caretakers to help deal with its emotional weather. And this situation continues as one grows. A parent's holding of their child's emotional experience is a critical factor in their child's development. Where there was malattunement between parent and child, there's likely to be a subsequent difficulty in that child's grown-up ability to regulate his or her own affect. The traumas of adulthood, our own and those affecting other people, those that arise in our intimate relationships, and those that color our experience of old age, illness, and death, are difficult, at least in part, because of how difficult their infantile counterparts were for our parents to handle. Early traumas restrict our ability to process later ones. Michael Eigen, a psychoanalyst here in New York, has written about how the early emotional rapport, or lack of rapport, lives on into adult life. The environmental support our aloneness gets is necessary and remains part of our sense of aloneness all throughout life. We may not cognize it clearly, but it lives inside us, part of an indistinguishable nexus of support that feeds a sense of existing. Eigen has called the background feeling of primary aloneness boundless, unknown support. And like Winnicott before him has proposed that when there is damage to this system early in life, the personality pays a price. Wounded aloneness is one way of describing the toll the self pays for relational failures. Winnicott describes the childhood version of this relational self with characteristic poignancy. His depiction of the holding environment a good enough parent creates is a template for both Buddhist mindfulness and psychoanalytically inspired psychotherapy. Listen to Winnicott's words. What is communicated when a mother adapts to her baby's needs? I refer to the concept of holding. We have two things, the mother holding the baby and the baby being held and rapidly going through a series of developmental phases which are of extreme importance for the establishment of the baby as a person. The mother does not need to know what is going on in the baby, but the baby's development cannot take place except in relation to the human reliability of the holding and handling. The baby goes easily to and fro from integration to the ease of relaxed unintegration, and the accumulation of these experiences becomes a pattern and forms a basis for what the baby expects. The baby comes to believe in a reliability in the inward processes leading to integration into a unit. But this kind of communication is silent. The baby does not hear or register the communication, only the effects of reliability. This is where the difference comes between mechanical perfection and human love. Human beings fail, and in the case of ordinary care, a mother is all the time mending her failures. These relative failures with immediate remedy undoubtedly add up eventually to a communication so that the baby comes to know about success. Successful adaptation gives a sense of security, a feeling of having been loved. As analysts, we know about this because we are all the time failing and we expect and get anger. It is the innumerable failures followed by the sort of care that mends, that builds up into a communication of love, of the fact that there is a human being there who cares. Where failure is not mended within the requisite time, seconds, minutes, or hours, then we use the term deprivation. A deprived child is one who, after knowing about failures mended, comes to experience failure unmended. It is then the life work of the child to provoke conditions in which failures mended once more give the pattern to life. That was Winnicott. And it's both meditation, Buddhism, and psychotherapy that contribute to mending those failures and bringing back the pattern and the reliability, the inner reliability of life. I was given a fresh insight into all of this some years ago when I was teaching a workshop with Professor Robert Thurman of Columbia University. It was from Professor Thurman that I learned that the root of the Sanskrit word for the liberating vision of emptiness, shunyata, derives from a word meaning to swell. The metaphorical meaning of the word implies the swelling of a seed or a pregnant womb. Buddha's emptiness was a full emptiness, one rich with potential, one big enough to hold the entire world of possibility, not an absolute nothingness the way I might have imagined it. One day when we were teaching together about this, Professor Thurman reached impulsively for a volume of his called Essential Tibetan Buddhism. On this particular day, he had been listening to me talk about Winnicott, about the good enough mother, and the way meditation and therapy mimics or repairs the holding environment of the early parent-infant couple. He realized he had translated a poem about it, one that I had never bothered to look at, buried as it was on page 209 of his text, deep in a chapter entitled Practicing the Liberating Wisdom. But there it was, the discovery of Mother Voidness, a song of enlightenment by the great Mongolian Lama, Jangkyo Rolwe Dorje, who lived between 1717 and 1786. He wrote it on the sacred mountain, Wu Tai Shan, in the Shensei province of China, in the aftermath of his enlightenment. Rolwe Dorje's verse was in a long line of enlightenment songs, whose function is to express, in Professor Thurman's words, joy and appreciation in the euphority and lucidity of just having attained a comprehensive freedom from ageless suffering and anxiety. It began like this. May the Guru who nakedly reveals this as it is, his kindness irrepayable, be enthroned in my heart. I will speak spontaneously whatever comes to mind. I was struck by the last line, speaking spontaneously whatever comes to mind. It startled me a little, evoking as it did the psychoanalytic tradition of Freud, whose technique of free association rested just on this activity of bare attention. They already knew about free association in the 1700s in Mongolia, I thought. I waited for what might come next. What would a newly enlightened Lama spontaneously declare? Here it is. I was like a mad child, long lost his old mother. Never could find her, though she was with him always. But now it seems I'm about to find that kind old mother, since big brother relativity hints where she hides. It was difficult for me to listen too carefully once Professor Thurman had spoken the first several lines of this verse. Something was choking up inside. Like a mad child, long lost his old mother, never could find her, though she was with him always. My mind kept repeating the phrase. I hadn't lost my own kind mother, but this didn't stop me from relating to the notion of mad child. Winnicott once wrote that there are two categories of people in the world, those who carry around having been mad and those who do not. By mad, I think he meant crazy, not angry, but there was a deliberate ambiguity in his words, a strong link between the two in his thinking. Having been mad, he proposed, meant there was once a breakdown at the dawn of an individual's life, a breakdown in the dynamic parent-infant environment that supports and facilitates development. Here was a Buddhist monk alluding to the same phenomenon. Thurman was evoking all this for me while reading the Mongolian verse. Here's more. I think yes, yes, then no, no, then could it be really? These various subjects and objects are my mother's smiling face. These births, deaths, and changes are my mother's lying words. My undeceiving mother has deceived me. My only hope of refuge is in relativity. The poem, Professor Thurman explained, is about trauma. It takes the smiling face of the mother as the prototype of the awakened or enlightened mind. A mother feels her infant to be the best of her and regards him or her thus. A mother is the most highly evolved of our mammalian species. Through learning to nurture and develop life within her own body, she has achieved a capacity for empathy and compassion that the rest of us are still searching for. This verse describes the perplexity of the monk as his understanding dawns. He's been searching for something outside of himself, imagining enlightenment as some kind of external achievement, as a place to be journeyed to or a state to be achieved, something apart from the trauma of everyday life. As he awakens, he starts to get glimmers of enlightenment in the everyday. He wonders if it could really be so, and begins to see that his habits of mind, his inhibitions of ego function, his habits of dissociation have kept him at a remove. The long-lost mother is shunyata, voidness, emptiness, freedom, the swelling, pregnant womb, the understanding that nothing exists independently, in its own right, apart from the world in which it is embedded. The Lama had felt himself to be absolutely alone, searching for release, a victim in our language of developmental or relational trauma. But his awakening came when he dropped this point of view. A shift took place, and Shunyata, mother to all, revealed herself, hiding in plain sight, part and parcel of the various subjects and objects mistakenly perceived as threatening and existing independently. She was there in all things, none of them isolated entities, as they were often imagined to be, but all of them relative, relational in nature, part of an interdependent whole that included the meditating Lama and his subjective awareness. His awakened mind finally understood oneness to be simultaneous with everything being different. The mother he was searching for was not outside of himself, he finally reasoned. She was him. His face, her face, and the world's face were the same surface. The undeceiving mother, present everywhere, had deceived him. I loved this image. It made something in me relax. Michael Eigen, who I quoted earlier on Boundless Unknown Support, has his own contemporary version of the Lama's poem. Winnicott writes of essential aloneness, Eigen says. Now that's a strong term, essential aloneness. He feels that we are all essentially alone. He says the baby is supported in an alone state by a not quite cognized presence. That is, we are supported. When we are supported well, we are supported in an alone state without quite realizing we are getting support. That's why, if therapy goes well, patients may feel they've done it all by themselves, and the therapist did very little. The patient did not know it was the therapist who helped. Well, that is a very good kind of help. Eigen, like the Mongolian Lama, affirmed that our essential aloneness is supported by an unknown, boundless presence, by the smiling face of the mother. For many people, aloneness can be wounded and seem oppressive, as it would to a mad child long lost its old mother, to a victim of trauma. But there is another experience waiting in the wings, one that can be divined with proper support and guidance, one that is part of our birthright. Never could find her, though she was with him always, sang the newly enlightened Lama. Dr. Eigen has said something similar. To be permeable and distinct, connected and separate, in union yet alone, is part of our plasticity and persistence, part of the mystery, difficulty, and creative challenge of our nature. Can we make room for ourselves? All of this speaks to the issue of trauma. As a famous psychoanalyst, Robert Stolorow, has pointed out, estrangement, alienation, and dissociation are inevitable consequences of trauma. One's emotional horizons are narrowed and deadened. A defensive self-ideal, purified of offending affect states, deemed offensive to self and others, is established, and one feels irrevocably separate from the rest of humanity. The need, he affirms, is for attunement and responsiveness, for a relational home in which emotional experience, no matter how crushing, can be held. This is what both meditation and psychotherapy are capable of providing. The American author Phil Clay, the author of an award-winning short story collection called Redeployment, about his time as a soldier in Iraq, puts it this way. Telling of an encounter with a female friend, herself a victim of childhood sexual abuse, he hears her say, after resonating with his description of the shocking numbness he felt, the dissociation he felt, looking at the victims of a suicide bombing. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't mean to compare my experience to yours. I could never imagine what you've been through." Why separate veterans from the rest of humankind, he asks. If we fetishize trauma as incommunicable, then survivors are trapped, unable to feel truly known by their non-military friends and family. He quotes the actor Adam Driver, speaking of the alienation he felt after leaving the Marine Corps and the healing he found in his work in the theater. Not being able to express the anger, confusion, and loneliness I felt was challenging, Driver said, until theater exposed him to playwrights and characters and plays that had nothing to do with the military, that were articulating experiences I had in the military that before, to me, were indescribable. Phil Clay continues, "You don't honor someone by telling them, 'I can never imagine what you've been through.' Instead, listen to their story and try to imagine being in it, no matter how hard or uncomfortable that feels." That's what we do in meditation. That's what a psychotherapist does. If the past years have taught us anything, says Clay, it's that in the age of the all-volunteer military, it's far too easy for Americans to send soldiers on deployment after deployment without making a serious effort to imagine what that means. We can do better. Over the years, when going on my silent meditation retreats, I always take a little notebook into these retreats with me, even though writing and reading is looked down upon during this time. And every time when I go, I end up writing down some version of the following phrase. It's not what you are experiencing that matters, it's how you relate to it. This is what moved me the most in the first place about Buddhism, something practical I could put my mind to. We can't make trauma go away, but we can change our response to it, turn down its valence, change the relational home in which it is experienced, spice up the flavor of the reunion. As Donald Winnicott used to say in a phrase that might equally well apply to the returning veteran or to the Mongolian Lama, it is a joy to be hidden, but disaster not to be found. It's my hope that the confluence of Buddhism and Western psychotherapy can help us all in our quest to be found. Thank you, and goodbye.
예, 감사합니다.